If you ever found yourself waking up in the heart of the Roman Empire, your first mistake would be assuming that Rome was anything like the grand marble city you see on postcards or in Hollywood films. The truth is that Rome was dirty, crowded and endlessly noisy, a place where 1,000 smells fought each other in the air, and every corner hid something that might either fascinate you or make you gag. The day would begin before sunrise, not because you wanted to, but because the city never really slept. Donkeys brayed, vendors shouted, and wagons rattled across uneven stones, shaking you awake whether you liked it or not. You'd probably be lying on a straw mattress inside a cramped insula, a Roman apartment block that looked impressive from afar, but was more of a death trap up close. The walls leaned in suspicious directions, the plaster flaked off in chunks, and the wooden stairs creaked, as though they had given up on their duty to hold anyone's weight. Fires were common, and the smell of smoke and waste lingered permanently, no matter how much fresh morning air tried to sweep it away. Stepping outside, you'd quickly discover that the city wasn't designed for comfort. The streets were narrow, paved with uneven cobblestones that would twist your ankle if you weren't careful. Mud and filth clung to your sandals, and open gutters carried the waste of thousands down toward the Tiber. If you're unlucky, and you would be, someone leaning out of a window might dump a bucket of kitchen scraps or worse onto your head. Romans did not always believe in waiting until nightfall to empty their chamber pots. Now the real misery begins. Trying to move through the crowds. Rome wasn't built for a gentle morning stroll. You'd have to push past hawkers selling bread that was either too stale or suspiciously cheap, and eye-twitching beggars who tugged at your tunic. Soldiers, strutting in their armor, would not make way for you. Instead, you'd be forced to step aside, nearly tumbling into a fruit stand, where the merchant would yell at you for disturbing his figs, and if you dared to complain, you'd risk more than a bruised ego. Romans were quick to anger, and fights often broke out for no greater reason than someone bumping a shoulder or stepping on a foot. Even if you managed to navigate without attracting a punch, your nose would be under constant assault. The smell of freshly baked bread tried in vain to compete with the reek of tanneries, rotting fish, and the acrid tang of smoke from blacksmith forges. Add to that the unfortunate perfume of too many bodies packed into too little space, most of them unwashed, and you would quickly give up any idea of breathing deeply. The soundscape was no better. Think of Rome not as a city, but as a permanent parade of chaos, hammering from construction sites, mixed with vendors shouting prices, children crying, animals braying, and orators declaiming speeches to anyone who would listen, or at least pretend to. You might pass the Forum, where men in togas waved their arms dramatically, arguing over laws you barely understood, while pickpockets slipped nimble fingers into pouches without anyone noticing until it was too late. You would also learn very quickly that personal space was not a Roman invention. At any moment, someone might shove past you carrying amphorae of wine, or a slave might bump into you while struggling with a load twice his body weight. Don't expect apologies. In Rome, the weak stepped aside, and the strong plowed ahead. By mid-morning, your sandals would already be coated in dust, your throat dry from the air, and your patience gone. You might think to step into a tavern for a drink of water, but that would be another mistake. Water was not always clean, and Romans preferred wine for a reason. It was safer than risking the bacteria swimming happily in your cup. The wine itself might not please you either. Watered down and often sour, it lacked the charm of the rich vintages modern people romanticize. Should you wish for a moment of peace, perhaps to lean against a wall and gather your thoughts, you'd quickly be reminded that Rome offered no such luxury. Guards patrolled to keep order. Dogs wandered sniffing for scraps, and vendors were relentless in their attempts to lure you into buying something you didn't want. If you were clearly foreign or dressed strangely, all the worse. Stares would follow you, and children might even throw pebbles or shout insults. Rome was not kind to outsiders, and you would stand out immediately. By noon, the sun would be merciless, bouncing off the stone walls and baking the city until every breath felt like inhaling dust. Shade was precious, and those lucky enough to own a shaded stall guarded it jealously. You would find yourself dizzy, overwhelmed, and wondering how anyone could possibly survive here day after day. But the Romans did. They thrived in this chaos, trained by necessity to endure discomforts that would send you running for modern comforts within an hour. This was just the street life, the surface level of Rome's daily grind. And yet, even now, you'd already feel the weight of the empire pressing in on you. A single morning would exhaust you more than a modern workday, and as you stumbled back through the crowds, dodging waste and shouts, you would realize one uncomfortable truth. Rome was not built for you. You wouldn't last a day here, not with your soft shoes, your clean habits, and your dreams of marble perfection. For Romans, this was ordinary. For you, it was survival. If you thought the streets of Rome were hard to endure, wait until you sit down to eat. Forget the warm bread rolls, juicy roasted meats, and fresh fruit platters of modern imagination. Roman dining was a test of endurance, and your stomach wouldn't last a day. Breakfast, if you could call it that, was usually nothing more than a hunk of stale bread dipped in watered-down wine or olive oil. Sometimes a lucky soul might have cheese, but most ordinary Romans made do with whatever. Scraps they had from the day before. Don't expect eggs or bacon sizzling on a skillet. Instead, imagine chewing through bread that crumbles into dry lumps, washing it down with wine that tastes like sour vinegar. Your morning would begin not with joy, but with resignation. By midday, hunger would gnaw at you again, and now you'd face the true test of Roman food. The city bustled with food stalls, thermopolia as they were called, where steaming pots lined wooden counters and vendors barked at customers. You'd peek inside, expecting something comforting. Instead, you'd find beans boiled into a paste, stews with more fat than meat, and sauces so salty they'd parch your tongue before quenching any hunger. Cheap cuts of meat, often riddled with gristle, floated in watery broths that smelled suspiciously of yesterday's leftovers reheated. If you ordered fish, you'd better prepare for disappointment. Without refrigeration, fish traveled into Rome, salted, dried, or half-spoiled. The smell alone could turn your appetite to ash. Worse, Romans were obsessed with a condiment called garum, a fermented fish sauce made by leaving anchovies and other small fish to rot in the sun until they melted into liquid. It was then poured over nearly everything: bread, meat, beans, even fruit. Imagine spooning rancid fish juice over your porridge, and you'll have an idea of what Roman cuisine really meant. For the wealthy, meals were far stranger. Invited to a banquet, you might expect elegance, but what you'd get was a circus of the bizarre. Picture platters of roasted dormice stuffed with nuts and honey, peacock roasted with its feathers reattached for show, and sausages made of ingredients you'd rather not ask about. Some dishes looked magnificent but tasted foul. Others were deliberately designed to shock. At one dinner, you might be served jelly made from boiled calf's brains. At another, flamingo tongues roasted in spiced wine. Rich Romans prized rarity and novelty over flavor, and what impressed them would send you sprinting for the nearest exit. But even setting aside extravagance, the basics could be dangerous. Grain formed the backbone of Roman diets, yet bread was often bulked up with fillers like ground beans, chalk, or even sawdust to stretch supplies. Eating too much could leave you doubled over with cramps. Fresh vegetables were scarce in the city, especially for the poor, and fruit was a luxury. Most people lived on bread, porridge, and watery stews, with the occasional scrap of meat or cheese. Malnutrition was so common that many Romans walked around with pale skin, thin limbs, and constant stomach complaints. You, used to modern diets with vitamins and variety, would likely feel weak within days, and then, of course, there was hygiene, or the lack of it. Street vendors didn't wash their hands between customers. Pots and bowls were rinsed at best. In dirty water drawn from a communal well, flies hovered over everything, and rats scurried beneath the counters. Imagine scooping a ladle of stew, only to notice a suspicious hair or a bug floating on the surface. Roman stomachs, hardened by years of exposure, managed to survive. Yours, however, would be in open rebellion before the day was done. Dining customs would unsettle you too. At banquets, guests reclined on couches while slaves served food, their bare hands passing bread, meat, and sauces from dish to dish. People ate with their fingers, wiping greasy hands on cloths or worse, on their tunics. Burping was acceptable, sometimes even praised as a compliment to the cook. Vomiting was not only tolerated, but occasionally encouraged, since it allowed guests to empty their stomachs and continue feasting. You might recoil, but Romans saw it as a mark of indulgence, proof of wealth and abundance. Even drinks came with hazards. Water from aqueducts was often clean when fresh, but by the time it reached crowded neighborhoods, pipes lined with lead had poisoned it. Romans, unknowingly sipping toxic water day after day, suffered symptoms that ranged from stomach pain to madness. Wine diluted with such water may have masked the taste, but it didn't save anyone from the slow damage. If you thought you could survive by sticking to fruit or honey cakes, think again. Fruit was seasonal, often overripe by the time it hit. The markets and cakes were rare treats, loaded with so much honey they'd rot your teeth in no time. There were no toothbrushes as you know them, only crude powders of crushed bone or charcoal. Dental pain was so common that few Romans over 30 had a full set of teeth left. By the end of your Roman day, you'd likely be doubled over in discomfort. A stomach unprepared for fish sauce, spoiled meats, and chalk-laden bread would protest loudly, and there'd be no relief in sight. Medicine, such as it was, offered little more than herbs, prayers, and questionable ointments. You'd lie awake at night in your smoky insula, clutching your gut and realizing another truth. Rome might conquer nations, but its food would conquer you. If you imagined Roman bathhouses as serene spas filled with marble pools and scented oils, prepare to be disappointed. The truth is that the baths were less about luxury and more about surviving the grime of the city. They were also crowded, noisy, and smelled less like lavender and more like a mixture of sweat, oil, and mildew. Step inside, and you'd quickly discover that this celebrated Roman pastime was not the relaxing escape you hoped for, but yet another ordeal you would not endure easily. The first thing you'd notice upon entering a public bathhouse was the sheer chaos. The baths were social hubs, drawing citizens of all classes together. Rich men came to display their status, poor men came to scrub off the filth of the streets, and everyone in between came to gossip, argue politics, or conduct business. The air buzzed with shouts, laughter, and heated debates. You'd find yourself dodging elbows as people jostled through narrow corridors, their bare feet slapping against damp stone floors. Before you could even dip a toe in the water, you'd be slathered with oil. Romans didn't use soap the way you do. Instead, they coated their bodies in olive oil and scraped it off with a curved metal tool called a strigil. The oil carried with it the sweat, dirt, and dead skin clinging to the body, which meant that the floor was always slick with discarded grime. Imagine standing barefoot on a wet surface, coated with a mixture of oil and skin flakes, trying not to slip as someone else scraped their back inches away from your face. Next came the plunge into the baths themselves. There wasn't just one pool, but several, each with its own temperature. The tepidarium was warm, the caldarium hot and steamy, and the frigidarium icy cold. The idea was to move between them, opening and closing your pores, but the reality was far less elegant. The caldarium reeked of sweat as dozens of men crowded into steaming water that hadn't been changed in days. Without chlorine or filters, the baths were breeding grounds for disease. Lice floated on the surface, skin flakes swirled in the steam, and more than one visitor coughed or sneezed directly into the water. The frigidarium was no better. The icy pool shocked your body, leaving your chest tight and your head spinning. You'd watch burly men dive in with laughter while you hesitated at the edge, shivering before finally plunging into water that smelled faintly of mildew. And when you climbed back out, there were no fluffy towels waiting. At best, a slave would hand you a rough cloth, still damp from the last user. At worst, you'd shake yourself off and let the air dry you, goosebumps rising as the noise of the baths swirled around you. What made the experience harder still was the lack of privacy. Bathhouses were communal, and nudity was the norm. Men lounged on benches, scratched themselves openly, and discussed business while dripping with water. Some bathhouses admitted women at separate hours, but most were male-dominated arenas of sweat and bravado. If you were shy, your modesty wouldn't last long. Stares, laughter, and the sheer press of bodies would remind you that Romans cared little for personal space. And then came the smells. Imagine dozens of bodies packed together in steamy chambers, the air thick with the scent of sweat mixed with olive oil, smoke from braziers, and faint traces of mildew clinging to the walls. The caldarium smelled like a damp cellar, the tepidarium like an overstuffed locker room. Even when perfume sellers drifted through the corridors, hawking scented oils, their wares barely masked the underlying stench. Your lungs would ache, your skin would feel greasy, and you'd long for the sting of modern soap and hot, clean water. For the wealthy, baths were occasions to show off. They'd arrive with servants carrying perfumes, towels, and silver strigils, strutting past poorer bathers with smug smiles. Some even brought food and wine, feasting between dips, their greasy fingers smearing benches already slick with oil. For the poor, there was no luxury. They scrubbed quickly, endured the crowds, and left before the heat overwhelmed them. You, caught in the middle, would be pushed and shoved, perhaps mocked for your hesitation, and certainly exhausted by the sheer intensity of the place. The bathhouse also doubled as a place for schemes and gossip. Men leaned together in corners, whispering about politics, scandals, or military campaigns. You'd overhear arguments about gladiators, senators, and the latest rumors from the provinces, all while someone scraped his armpits with a strigil. Beside you, business deals were struck, friendships broken, and rivalries flared in these steamy halls. The baths weren't just for washing, they were for plotting, competing, and showing off. By the time you staggered out, your head spinning. From heat and noise, you wouldn't feel refreshed at all. Your skin would be coated with a faint, oily residue, your hair damp and sticky, and your nostrils still clogged with the sour scent of the caldarium. Instead of relaxation, you'd feel drained, craving quiet air and clean solitude that Rome could not offer. For the Romans, this was daily life, a routine as normal as brushing teeth. For you, it would be overwhelming, unsanitary, and suffocating, and yet to skip the baths would make you stand out. To avoid them would brand you strange, perhaps even barbaric, since the Romans considered bathing essential to civilized life. You couldn't refuse without raising eyebrows, but enduring them would be its own trial. The baths, far from the marble paradise of imagination, were proof that Roman life was not built for your comfort. They were loud, sweaty, crowded, and filled with smells you'd never forget. By nightfall, you'd still carry the odor of empire on your skin, a reminder that Rome's glory came with grime, and that even its most celebrated pleasures could feel like punishment. If the baths left you drained, the arena would leave you shaken. Rome's gladiatorial games were hailed as the greatest entertainment of the empire, spectacles that defined Roman identity. But to you, a modern visitor, they would feel less like a thrilling show and more like a nightmare. Loud, brutal, and overwhelming to every sense, your ordeal would begin long before you even entered the Colosseum. The crowd swarmed the streets like a tide, thousands of citizens marching toward the massive amphitheater. Merchants shouted, selling roasted nuts, watered wine, and cheap trinkets shaped like swords and helmets. Beggars lined the walls, hoping for coins from excited spectators. Soldiers barked orders to keep the crowds moving. You'd be shoved and jostled until your ribs ached, the noise already deafening, and you hadn't even stepped inside yet. When the Colosseum loomed ahead, it would steal your breath. Its sheer size would dwarf anything you've seen, an arena capable of holding more than 50,000 people. But the wonder would fade as you passed through the arches. Inside, the smell hit you first. Sweat, dust, and the coppery tang of blood, clinging to the stones like a memory. The roar of the crowd thundered in your chest, a sound so powerful you'd feel it in your bones. Modern stadiums are loud, but this was different. Here, the noise wasn't just cheering, it was a raw hunger for violence. You'd take your seat, probably far up in the stands with the poorer citizens, squinting down at the sand-covered arena floor. The air would shimmer with heat, and the sound would be relentless. Drums pounding, horns blaring, voices shouting in unison. Every word the announcers cried was swallowed by the roar of the mob, a chorus of tens of thousands demanding blood. You'd feel your ears ring, your throat dry, your heartbeat quickening. Then the games would begin. First came the parades. Gladiators, marching in gleaming armor, their muscles glistening with oil, their weapons flashing in the sunlight. The crowd roared louder still, each faction cheering for its favorite fighters. You might try to admire the discipline, the pageantry, but your stomach would turn when you realized what came next. This wasn't a performance, it was survival, and someone was about to die for the sake of amusement. The clang of swords, the grunt of bodies colliding, the scream of a man pierced by a spear. These sounds would echo across the arena, magnified by stone walls. You'd watch blood spatter the sand, staining it dark, while the crowd cheered wildly. Children clapped, men shouted wages, women waved scarves for their favorite fighters. To them, this was excitement. To you, it would be horror disguised as entertainment. Worse still, gladiators were not always evenly matched. Sometimes a skilled warrior faced a trembling novice, or a man armed with a sword fought one given nothing but a net and trident. The crowd loved unfair odds. It made the struggle more dramatic. You, however, would see desperation in the fighters' eyes. Men battling not for glory, but because refusal meant certain death. The applause would thunder louder with every wound, every stumble, until finally a gladiator fell to the ground. This was the moment the crowd lived for. The wounded man would raise a finger, begging for mercy. The victor would stand poised, sword ready, waiting for the emperor, or at times the mob itself, to decide. "Spare him!" some would cry. "Kill him!" Others roared louder, thirsting for blood. The final verdict, given with a gesture, would seal the man's fate. If death was chosen, the victor plunged his blade down, and the crowd erupted in ecstasy. You'd sit frozen, sickened, unable to join in their cheers. And that was only the beginning. Between gladiator duels came other spectacles. Wild beast hunts, where lions, tigers, and bears were unleashed against poorly armed men. The crowd roared at the sight of exotic animals brought from the corners of the empire, tearing into human flesh. You'd cover your ears, but the screams and growls would still reach you, a brutal symphony echoing in your skull. The games could last all day, the sun beating down while blood soaked the sand. The smell of death would mingle with food vendors, weaving through the stands, selling sausages and bread as if nothing horrific were unfolding below. You'd feel nauseated watching a man breathe his last breath while someone next to you licked grease from his fingers and shouted for more. Even the quieter moments would unsettle you. After battles, slaves dragged corpses away, their blood leaving dark trails on the sand. Fresh sand was scattered to cover the stains, and the next fight began as if nothing had happened. The cruelty was endless, casual, and routine. For Romans, this was tradition. For you, it would be unbearable. By the time the final horn sounded and the crowd poured out into the streets, your ears would still be ringing, your body trembling from the sheer force of the spectacle. You'd carry with you not only the sight of violence, but the realization that tens of thousands around you had enjoyed it, cheering for death as though it were music. Rome's gladiatorial games weren't just entertainment. They were proof of an empire's hunger for control, for dominance, for blood. And as you stumbled away, sickened and deafened, you would know beyond doubt, your ears, your mind, and your heart could never endure what the Romans called sport. If you thought watching the gladiators was exhausting, try living as one of Rome's soldiers. To the Romans, military service was the backbone of the empire, the discipline that built roads, conquered provinces, and held borders against endless enemies. But for you, a modern outsider, marching even a single day with a Roman legion would break your spirit and your body long before the sun set. Your misery would begin at dawn. The trumpet blared, pulling you from shallow sleep on a straw mat. There was no soft mattress, no coffee to ease you awake. Instead, you'd be ordered to rise quickly, pull on rough woolen tunic and armor, and prepare to march. The centurion's voice, harsh and unyielding, cut through the morning chill. Any hesitation earned you a blow from his vine staff for Roman. Discipline had no patience for weakness. Then came the weight. A legionary's pack, called the sarcina, carried nearly everything needed for survival. Sling it across your shoulders, and you'd stagger forward, shocked by its burden, at least 30 kilograms, sometimes closer to 40. Inside were your weapons. A gladiator's sword and javelins, cooking pots, rations of grain, spare clothing, stakes for building camp fortifications, and a shovel for digging. Add your shield and armor, and you'd feel as though you were carrying another person on your back. The Romans nicknamed themselves Marius's mules, beasts of burden more than men, and after only a few steps you'd understand why. March itself was unrelenting. 20 miles in a day was standard, 30 not uncommon, all across uneven terrain. There were no breaks for comfort. The sun beat down, your sandals rubbed blisters into your feet, and dust choked your throat. The man ahead of you set the pace, and you dared not fall behind. The line of soldiers stretched endlessly, each step pounding like a drumbeat, and the centurions barked constantly to keep order. If your pack slipped, if your stride faltered, you risked not only punishment, but the scorn of your comrades. Rome valued endurance, not excuses. Food on the march offered no relief. Each soldier carried raw grain, not baked bread. At night, after hours of marching, you'd grind the grain by hand and boil it into a tasteless porridge. If lucky, you might add a shred of cheese or dried meat. But there was no feast, no comfort, only the bare minimum to fuel another day. The wine was thin and sour, mixed with water to make it last, leaving your mouth dry even after drinking. Hunger gnawed, but fatigue was stronger, and there was no rest when the march ended. The legion never camped without fortifying its ground. Every evening after miles of walking, you'd be ordered to dig ditches, raise earthen walls, and drive. Sharpen stakes into place. Only once the camp was secure could you eat or sleep. Your body, already trembling from the weight of the march, would be pushed into further labor. Your hands blistered from the shovel, your muscles aching as if they might tear. And the knowledge lingered. Tomorrow, it all began again. The discipline was absolute. Step out of line, and you faced flogging. Fall asleep on guard duty, and you faced death. Romans believed a single weak soldier could doom an entire legion, and so mercy was rare. Punishments were brutal, sometimes inflicted on groups to keep fear sharp. If a unit fled in battle, it might suffer decimation, every 10th man executed by his comrades. Imagine standing in line as lots were drawn, praying you wouldn't be chosen to die, all while knowing that tomorrow you'd still be expected to march as though nothing had happened. And then there was the enemy. For every weary mile, the threat of ambush lingered. Tribes, rebels, or bandits might descend from hills or forests, forcing you into sudden battle with no rest, no preparation. You'd be shoved into formation, shield raised, sword ready, heart hammering in your chest as arrows whistled past. The clang of metal, the screams of wounded men, the chaos of combat, all of it would erupt while you were still dizzy with exhaustion. Survival was never certain, and courage was demanded even when your knees trembled, but perhaps the cruelest test was the monotony. Days bled into one another. March, dig, eat, sleep, repeat. The endless tramp of feet, the stink of sweat soaking into your tunic, the ache of blisters that never healed. The songs and chants of your comrades might lift your spirit briefly, but soon even those faded into background noise. You'd dream of rest, of soft beds and silence, but Rome's legions offered neither. They offered only duty, and the constant reminder that your life belonged not to you, but to the empire. By the time night fell, you'd collapse onto the hard ground, too tired to speak, too sore to think. Your feet would be raw, your shoulders bruised, your mind dulled by the rhythm of obedience. And yet you'd hear the centurion's voice promising another long march tomorrow. Rome did not stop for the weak. The empire marched forward on the strength of its soldiers, and if you couldn't keep up, you'd be left behind. For the Romans, this was honor, discipline, and duty. For you, it would be torment beyond endurance. A single day in the legion would break your body, and a week would break your spirit. The empire was built on men who could march until their feet bled and still lift their swords at the end of the day. You, soft and untrained, would last no longer than the morning trumpet. If the legion tested your body, the Roman Forum would test your patience. You might imagine it as the shining center of Roman law and politics, where wise men debated noble matters beneath marble temples. In truth, the Forum was less a dignified stage of governance and more a noisy marketplace of gossip, scandal, and endless shouting. Spend a day there, and you'd discover that Rome's real empire was built not only with swords, but also with words. Words that twisted, stung, and never stopped. The Forum itself was an impressive sight at first glance. Tall columns of temples rose above the bustling square. Statues of gods and generals glared from pedestals, and the Senate's great hall loomed like a symbol of authority. But any sense of grandeur quickly vanished once you stepped into the crush of bodies. Merchants shouted prices, beggars reached for your tunic, lawyers bellowed arguments, and orators climbed makeshift platforms to harangue the crowds. It was less a political heart and more a carnival of voices, each one determined to drown out the others. If you hoped to hear law being discussed with dignity, you'd be sorely disappointed. The courts in the Forum were open-air affairs, surrounded by jeering spectators. Lawyers strutted about like actors on a stage, their voices theatrical, their gestures exaggerated. Evidence mattered less than persuasion. A clever turn of phrase, a dramatic pause, even a well-timed tear could sway the outcome of a trial. And the crowd, far from silent, cheered or booed openly, influencing judgment with their noise. To you, it would feel more like street theater than justice. But the real business of the Forum wasn't law, it was gossip. Everywhere you turned, people whispered rumors. One senator was accused of bribery. Another was said to be sleeping with his rival's wife. A general returning from the provinces was rumored to have stolen more than he conquered. Slaves carried messages between cliques. Women in fine stolas leaned together to share scandals, and even children picked up tidbits to repeat at home. News traveled faster through rumor than through any official proclamation, and the truth was always secondary to a good story. For you, standing amid this constant chatter, it would be maddening. Strangers grabbed your arm to pull you into arguments about laws you'd never heard of. Orators demanded your applause as they railed against taxes, grain shortages, or corruption. One moment you'd hear that the emperor was generous and beloved. The next, someone would whisper he was cruel and doomed. The contradictions piled up until your head spun. Nothing seemed stable, nothing certain. The noise never relented. Shoemakers hawked sandals, priests announced sacrifices, soldiers bragged about campaigns. Street performers played flutes and drums to draw crowds, drowning out the voices of men swearing solemn oaths. The smell of roasting meat from nearby stalls mixed with incense from temple altars, confusing your senses. You'd find yourself dizzy, caught in the swirl of words, smoke and dust, wondering how anyone could concentrate long enough to govern an empire in such chaos. And yet decisions were made here. Grain distributions were announced, new laws proclaimed, alliances struck. But even these serious matters were tainted by spectacle. Senators bribed the crowd with free games or food to gain support. Wealthy men hired cliques of followers to cheer for them and boo their opponents. Politics was theatre, and the audience was easily swayed. You might watch as a man declared war with a flourish, cheered not because of strategy, but because his speech made the people laugh. The fate of provinces could turn on the sharpness of a joke. For the ordinary Roman, the forum was as much entertainment as it was governance. People came not to witness justice, but to be amused, to hear the latest scandal, to shout opinions and feel part of the noise. For you, however, it would be exhausting. The sheer volume of voices, the heat of bodies pressed together, the endless swirl of rumor and rhetoric, it would wear you down faster than any march with the legion. At least in the army, silence existed at night. In the forum, the noise never stopped. By mid-afternoon, your head would pound from the constant din. You'd try to escape, but the crowd surged around you, pulling you into yet another argument, or shoving you toward yet another shouting match. Someone might thrust a wax tablet in your hand, urging you to sign your support for a petition. Another might accuse you of being on the wrong side of politics, demanding to know where your loyalties lay. Neutrality wasn't tolerated. In Rome, everyone had to take a side, even if they barely understood the question. When you finally broke free and staggered into quieter streets, you'd feel drained, your ears ringing, your mind cluttered with half-heard rumors and contradictory claims. You'd realize that truth mattered little in the forum. Power belonged to those who could shout the loudest, persuade the quickest, and entertain the most. The empire's laws might be written in stone, but its politics were scribbled in gossip. For Romans, this was normal. For you, it would be unbearable. The forum wasn't a place of clarity. It was a storm of noise and deception. You wouldn't last a day there without feeling smothered by words, dizzy from contradictions, and desperate for silence. If the forum battered your ears by day, the insula would torment you by night. These towering apartment blocks housed most of Rome's population, cheap, crowded, and dangerously unstable. Forget the villas of marble courtyards and shaded gardens. Those belonged to the wealthy elite. You, like the vast majority, would find yourself crammed into a dingy upper floor of an insula, where the night brought no peace, only noise, discomfort, and the constant threat of disaster. From the outside, an insula might look impressive. 4, 5, sometimes 6 stories of stacked balconies rising above the street. But step inside, and you'd see the truth. Narrow staircases twisted upward, creaking with every step. The walls leaned like tired men ready to collapse. The smell of damp plaster, stale cooking smoke, and human waste hung heavy in the air. Fires were common, collapses even more so. To live here was to gamble every night with your life. Your own room would be scarcely more than a cell. A single window, if you were lucky, opened onto the noisy street. Inside, space was so limited. You might sleep beside your family on a straw-stuffed mattress, the floor beneath you sticky from spilled oil or wine. The walls were thin, so thin you could hear your neighbors argue, laugh, or snore as if they were lying beside you. Privacy was a fantasy. Every cough, every whispered secret, every child's cry carried through the plaster as though amplified. And then came the noises of the city itself, which never truly slept. From your window drifted the clatter of wagon wheels, the braying of donkeys, the barking of stray dogs. Vendors hawked food late into the night, and drunkards stumbled home from taverns, singing off-key until they collapsed. Somewhere nearby, a smith hammered late into the evening, the rhythm echoing against the stones. Even if your eyes grew heavy, the city would not allow silence. Smells tormented you just as much. Your neighbor below might cook cabbage or fish, and the stench would rise through the floorboards, clinging to your hair and clothes. Smoke from cheap braziers filled the halls, mixing with the acrid scent of chamber pots emptied too late. Sewage trickled down gutters outside, its odor seeping in with every draught. You'd lie awake, choking, your stomach twisting, wondering how anyone could breathe in such air night after night. And if the smells and sounds didn't keep you awake, the fear would. Fires started easily in the insula. A single overturned lamp could ignite the wooden beams, and flames would race upward in minutes. With no organized fire brigade, escape was often impossible. Families were trapped, their cries echoing as the structure collapsed. Even without fire, collapse threatened constantly. Shoddy construction and overcrowding meant walls crumbled, floors caved in, and entire buildings fell into rubble. Each creak of the timbers above your head was a reminder that the roof might come crashing down while you slept. Even comfort itself was absent. Your straw mattress scratched your skin, crawling with fleas. Rats scurried in the corners, bold enough to nibble at crumbs near your bed. In summer, the air was stifling, the single window letting in more heat than relief. In winter, the chill seeped through the walls, leaving you shivering beneath a thin wool blanket. Hunger gnawed, for supper had likely been little more than porridge or stale bread, and the cold made the ache sharper. If you managed to drift into shallow sleep, you'd likely be jolted awake by the sounds of your neighbors. Arguments broke out over food, money, or spilled oil. Couples quarreled, children wailed, dogs barked. Sometimes fights turned violent, and you'd hear the crash of pottery, the thud of fists, even a scream cut short. And through it all, the thin walls ensured you were never truly alone. You lived cheek by jowl with dozens of others, their lives pressed against yours, their troubles leaking into your fragile rest. At dawn, when exhaustion finally dragged your eyes closed, the city woke again. Wagons rattled, vendors shouted, horns blared from the forum. The insula itself came alive, with footsteps on the stairs, pots clanging in kitchens, doors slamming as people hurried to work. There was no such thing as sleeping in. Rome allowed no rest. After even one night, your body would ache, your mind foggy, your nerves frayed from the constant noise and fear. And yet for the Romans, this was life. They had grown used to it, hardened by necessity. Children learned to sleep through shouting. Adults accepted discomfort as normal, and only the wealthy could afford the peace of quiet villas far from the city's din. For you, it would be unbearable. The insula would strip you of sleep, of privacy, of safety. By morning you'd stumble into the streets more exhausted than when you had gone to bed. The empire might seem glorious by day, but by night, in the cramped darkness of an insula, it revealed its true cost. Restless bodies crammed together, sleepless, fearful, enduring because they had no other choice. If the nights in a Roman insula left you weary, the morning would demand something even heavier, the constant attention owed to the gods. Rome was a city built on ritual, its very survival credited not to generals or emperors, but to the favor of unseen powers. And if you thought you could slip through life quietly, ignoring temples, sacrifices, or prayers, you would soon discover how impossible that was. From the moment you stepped into the street, the gods were everywhere. Shrines stood at every corner, their tiny altars piled with offerings, figs, coins, bits of bread, the smoke of incense rising into the dusty air. Even the walls of houses bore painted images of household deities, the Lares and Penates, guardians of food and fire. Passing without at least a nod, a whispered word or a small coin tossed into the offering bowl would mark you as strange, careless, even dangerous. To neglect the gods was not just personal, it risked angering the powers that protected the city itself. If you rented a room in an insula, your landlord might have a shrine tucked into the hallway, a little alcove where neighbors left garlands or poured wine. In your own room, however small, you were expected to keep a household shrine, however humble. A lamp, a clay figure, a pinch of incense. These little gestures kept your ancestors appeased and your home safe. Forgetting to light the lamp or skipping the morning ritual was a small rebellion, but one noticed by watchful eyes. Rome lived and breathed through these observances. Public life revolved around them even more. The calendar itself was thick with feast days, fast days, holy days when work stopped, markets closed, and entire districts gathered to celebrate. You would find yourself drawn into parades, sacrifices, and long ceremonies that could stretch for hours beneath the hot sun. Priests in white togas led oxen draped with ribbons to be slaughtered, their blood staining the altars while the crowd watched in reverent silence. The smell of burning entrails drifted into the air, smoke rising as if to reach the gods themselves. You might feel queasy, but for the Romans the scent was not disgusting, it was holy. There was also pressure. The Romans believed the favor of the gods decided everything. Harvests, wars, even the health of the emperor. If a ritual went wrong, if a sacrifice was botched, if an omen was ignored, disaster was sure to follow. One wrong move could doom not just you, but your family, your neighbors, even the whole city. Imagine the weight of that expectation. Every bird in the sky, every flash of lightning, every stumble in a priest's words became a sign that must be interpreted. You could not escape this world of symbols and divine warnings. The gods themselves were endless. Jupiter, Juno, Mars, Venus, Saturn, Neptune, Vesta. The list stretched on, each with their temples, each demanding their own sacrifices and rites. You might think keeping track of one god was difficult, but in Rome there were hundreds. Every profession had its patron. Every street seemed to have its favorite, and foreign gods from Greece, Egypt, and beyond slipped easily into the city's crowded pantheon. To live in Rome was to constantly juggle divine debts. Miss one, and you risked being whispered about as irreligious, untrustworthy, or cursed. Even politics was bound up in religion. Before the Senate met, priests examined the skies for omens. Before armies marched, generals consulted augurs, watching the flight of birds or the eating habits of sacred chickens to decide whether the gods approved. Refusing to believe or laughing at such rituals would not free you. It would only make you an outcast. A soldier would never march beside a man who mocked the augurs. A neighbor would never trust a man who skipped the household shrine. Piety was social glue, and without it you would be cut off. And then there were the festivals. You might think them a relief from labor, but they could be just as exhausting. The Saturnalia, with its wild feasting and role reversals, left the streets roaring with drunken songs. The Lupercalia, where men dressed in skins ran through the streets striking women with leather thongs to ensure fertility, would strike you as both chaotic and disturbing. To decline to join, to stand aside while others laughed and shouted, would make you a stranger in your own neighborhood. The gods did not allow neutrality. Even at night, you would not be free of their presence. Dreams were thought to be messages. From the divine, signs to be interpreted. Temples stayed open, their lamps burning through the darkness, guardians of a restless city. The gods were never far away, never quiet, never merciful to those who ignored them. In your exhausted state, still reeling from sleepless nights in the insula, you might wish for silence, for privacy, for the freedom to live without endless rituals. But Rome offered no such choice. By the end of even one day, you would find yourself bowed by obligation. A coin here, a prayer there, the smoke of sacrifices choking the air, the endless cycle of festivals, omens and warnings, it would wear you down as surely as hunger or fatigue. The gods did not just demand your attention, they consumed it until every step of your life was shadowed by their unseen hands. And if you dared to stop, dared to live without them, the people around you would make sure you didn't last long. To the Romans, neglecting the gods was not just foolish, it was treason against the very order of the world. If you thought the Romans worked hard and prayed harder, you might believe their entertainments offered relief. In truth, the leisure of Rome was its own kind of torment, and a modern soul like yours would find little rest in it. The empire loved spectacle, but its spectacles were bloody, noisy, and overwhelming, designed not for comfort, but for the rough taste of a people hardened by war. The Colosseum loomed as the crown jewel of Roman entertainment. From the outside, you might be impressed by its sheer size, its sweeping arches and endless ranks of stone. But inside, you would feel crushed by the weight of thousands of spectators, their voices rising in a deafening roar. The seats were packed, the air thick with sweat, smoke, and the smell of cheap food. Sunlight beat down mercilessly on the stone, and if you were unlucky enough to sit far from the shade, your skin would burn while the crowd surged and shouted around you. The games themselves were not gentle amusements. Gladiators fought with real steel, their bodies cut and battered, blood splattering the sand. The crowd cheered at each blow, as if the pain of others was their greatest joy. For a Roman, this was a lesson in courage, in endurance, in the glory of facing death with dignity. For you, unused to such sights, the clash of blades and the cries of wounded men would turn your stomach. You could not look away, for the crowd around you would jeer at any sign of softness. If you turned your head, if you covered your eyes, you would be mocked as weak, unfit for the empire. And gladiators were only the beginning. There were animal hunts, staged with imported beasts from across the empire, lions, tigers, elephants, bears, driven into the arena to be slain by hunters, or to tear apart criminals condemned to death. The Romans marveled at the sight, a living map of their dominion made flesh, but you would see cruelty. The terrified cries of the animals, the mangled remains of men torn to pieces. It would not be thrilling, but horrifying, to endure even. One morning of such sport would leave you shaken, sleepless, and wishing for escape. Nor did the entertainment end with blood. Chariot races thundered through the Circus Maximus, teams of horses charging neck to neck at breakneck speed. Dust filled the air, grit stinging your eyes and throat, while tens of thousands screamed for their favored colors: red, blue, green, white. Betting was rampant, and fights broke out in the stands as passions flared. The danger was not confined to the track. Horses collided, drivers were thrown, wheels splintered, spectacular crashes that left men crushed beneath hooves and wood. The crowd cheered loudest when disaster struck, thrilled by the danger. For you, the chaos, the violence, the endless noise would be more exhausting than exciting. Even the theatres which you might hope would offer calmer diversions carried their own discomforts. The plays were long, the humour often crude, and the audiences restless. Actors wore masks that distorted their voices, while hecklers shouted from the crowd. Fights could break out here too, over seating or insults. You would find little peace in a Roman performance, only more pressure to laugh when the crowd laughed, to jeer when they jeered, to be swept into the rough rhythm of a people who demanded constant stimulation. Perhaps worst of all was that these entertainments were unavoidable. They were woven into civic life, celebrated as the glory of Rome itself. Emperors sponsored games to win the people's favor, showering the masses with bread and spectacle. Attendance was not just a choice, it was a duty, a mark of belonging. To skip the games, to remain in your room while others flocked to the arena, would set you apart. Neighbors would ask why you had not gone, why you did not cheer, why you did not share in the common joy of Rome. Your absence would be suspicious. So, you would go again and again, dragged by expectation and the pull of the crowd. Each time you would emerge more weary, more hollow, your senses battered by noise and blood. Sleep would not come easily after a day of gladiators or the shrieks of dying beasts. The roar of the mob would echo in your head long into the night, leaving you restless in your cramped insula, longing for quiet that Rome never granted. What the Romans called pleasure would feel, to you, like punishment. To live in their world was to be bombarded by violence and spectacle until even leisure became a burden. Rome did not offer rest, it offered frenzy. And if you longed for peace, you would not last long in a city that measured joy by the cries of the dying and the crash of chariots on stone. By now you may have realized that Rome was not built for comfort, nor for the faint-hearted. It was a world of dust, hunger, noise, and constant demands, where every moment pressed down on you like the weight of stone columns. To live even a single day in the Roman Empire was to surrender yourself to a system larger than you could ever imagine, a machine of power and tradition that never stopped grinding. Everywhere you turned, the empire demanded something of you. Taxes drained what little coin you could scrape together, paid not in silent transactions, but in long hours of waiting, bargaining, and enduring the scrutiny of collectors who held your fate in their ledgers. If you missed your dues, if you faltered even once, punishments could fall swiftly, and no one would come to your aid. The law was not made for fairness, but for order, and you were a mere cog in its turning gears. Even in your private life, there was no real escape. Neighbors pressed into your walls, their quarrels and smells invading your small room. Family obligations tied you to rituals and roles that allowed no pause. The gods demanded offerings, the emperor demanded loyalty, and your fellow Romans demanded participation in every spectacle, every ritual, every act of civic life. To step aside, to say no, to claim solitude was to court suspicion. The empire had no room for the individual. It only had room for the whole, the collective body of Rome, marching forward, crushing all that resisted. The physical weight was just as relentless. Stone roads bruised your feet, coarse wool scratched. Your skin, smoky fires stung your eyes. The city itself seemed to press upon your shoulders, with its towering walls, its endless stairs, its crowded streets that left you gasping for air. There was no soft bed, no clean pillow, no quiet corner to rest your mind. Nights were as loud as days, filled with carts rumbling, dogs barking, drunks shouting, and fires crackling in the distance. Even your sleep was never fully yours. And then there was the unspoken burden, fear. Fear of plague, which could sweep through at any moment, carried by rats and poor water. Fear of fire, which could consume whole neighborhoods in the space of an afternoon. Fear of the empire itself. For one wrong word against an official, one slip of the tongue about the emperor, could bring ruin not only upon you, but upon your family. Even laughter had to be measured, for the walls seemed to listen, and Rome had ways of silencing those who forgot themselves. Yet the heaviest weight was the expectation of endurance. Romans prized toughness, the ability to suffer without complaint, to press on through hunger, pain, or humiliation. A Roman did not whine, he endured. He did not ask for relief, he bent his back until it broke. This was the spirit that built their roads, conquered their provinces, and filled their arenas with blood. And for you, raised in a world of comforts, of choices, of freedoms, this relentless demand for endurance would crush you. Your body would ache, your spirit would falter, and in the eyes of Rome, you would be judged unworthy, not because you lacked strength, but because you lacked submission. Rome was, in the end, not just a city, but an empire of expectations, and the heaviest weight it placed upon your shoulders was not the dust, not the taxes, not even the fear, but the need to belong. To be Roman was to surrender yourself fully to Rome, to allow its noise, its gods, its laws, and its hunger for spectacle to fill your life until nothing remained of your own. And if you could not do that, if you could not give yourself over, then you would not last a day. The empire was mighty, yes, it was enduring, yes, but it was also suffocating, crushing those who did not bend to its will. You would stand beneath its stone arches and feel not awe but weight. You would walk its streets and feel not freedom but chains. And though history may paint Rome in marble and gold, the truth is that for those who lived within it, life was heavy, hard, and merciless. So close your eyes now and let the dust of Rome settle. The empire is gone, its weight lifted at last, its glory crumbled into ruins. But remember this, if you had been there, if you had tried to live it, you would not have lasted a single day.